Hey, English 11B. It's Monday, April 13th, 2020, and today is a big day because we are introducing the next reading unit, which is going to be Realism and Naturalism. This unit is going to lead us to our first summative, which is going to be a reading and analysis summative. So you will be getting texts that you have not seen before and identifying the traits of realism and naturalism in those texts. There will also be a question referring to the narratives of enslaved people. So just keep in mind that the notes that you take today are super important, and we have not 100% moved on from the narratives of enslaved people just yet. Okay, so right now, to get ready for this lesson, I would take out your notes. I've also provided for you some note organizers that I designed, which are posted to Classroom. If you have a printer, feel free to print these out. If not, it's not a big deal. You can also organize your notes so that you have these headers. But today you're taking notes on realism and on naturalism. Both literary genres were occurring during the same period of time, but they had a little bit different beliefs. So we'll be differentiating those today. All right. My goal is to give you an overview of these notes, and then you can access these slides on your own to actually take notes if this video isn't too long. So, the Civil War ended in 1865, and it was the Civil War that changed what people were writing about. So before realism and naturalism, we had the Romantics, and they, remember, were incredibly romantic. They talked a lot about imagination and love and poetry and nature, and they cared about just like detaching from the world and being one with nature, and everything was heavenly. Then the Civil War happens and people get a reality check, which is where we get realism. All right. So this is also turn of the century, which means that we have Reconstruction happening at the same time that we have the Gilded Age happening. Reconstruction was 1865 to 77, and this is the time when we were reconstructing the country, figuring out how to rebuild after this incredibly divisive event in our history. And then the Gilded Age begins, which was when we start getting all of our pioneers in business and industry, and they create these monopolies and basically switch the economy of America from farming and agriculture to industrial, and everybody moves to the cities. So we're in this crazy time of change, which is then being reflected in what people are creating for art and literature. All right, so realism and naturalism is Civil War to 1914. Quick history pop quiz. What begins in 1914? World War I, which brings us to our next period of literature. So historical context speed round. You can come back and look at these slides a little bit more if you'd like, but I'm going to fly through them just to give you an idea of what was going on. So first of all, we have our industrialists. These names should sound familiar to you. Andrew Carnegie, who was in charge of steel, Rockefeller in charge of oil, Vanderbilt in charge of transportation, JP Morgan was our finance guy, and Henry Ford was mass production. So these guys are the fathers of industry during the Gilded Age and the turn of the century. They're the ones who are pretty much changing what America looks like, and become the inspiration for a lot of the literature being written. And we have naturalism. So naturalism is more inspired by the big changes that were happening in science and invention. So the main players of naturalism were going to be Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution, which was just mind-boggling for people. Alexander Graham Bell, who was one of the great inventors, of course, of the telephone and many other things. Thomas Edison, of the light bulb, electricity, and so many more inventions that I had no idea until I started diving into the history of this time. But these were the players of the naturalists. These were the inspiration of the naturalists. We also had George Washington Carver, an African-American man who actually made peanut production become this really revolutionary invention. Right? So realism is focused on kind of the cities and industry. Naturalism is more focused on science and this idea of the human existence and fate. So these players then create all these different things that are changing America. Transcontinental Railroad, Carnegie Steel, telephones invented, the first record player, the first light bulb, the workforce shifts, electric power, skyscraper. All of these things are happening. The world is changing. Cause and effect. If the world was changing this much, how would you be feeling? If suddenly people are moving to the cities, what was once a 3-story building is now a 20-story building, everything's moving up, everything's getting really busy, inventions are happening, it's exciting, but what else might you be feeling? Okay? There might be anxiety, there might be fear, there might be excitement, there might be motivation. Okay? This is when the American dream really kicks off because people want to be Rockefeller, they want to be Carnegie. All right. So, thinking about feelings, art imitates life. So, what I want us to make the connection of is history and the context determines what is talked about in literature because whatever's happening in the world inspires how we're feeling, which inspires what we write about. This is why we showed you that pandemic poem at the beginning of this class, because that's what's happening in the world right now. That is what inspired that writer. And it's really, really relatable for readers right now because we're living it. But in order for us to really understand history and what America has come from, we have to read the art that was created because that's going to be the most vulnerable and honest thing being created versus a history book. All right. So those notes that I just went over that you can revisit in the slides and go at your own pace because I'm going very quickly, that is going to be the historical context and the emotion for both realism and naturalism. The next thing that I'm going to dive into are the characteristics of each of these literary periods. So first we have realism. All right, for realism, we have 6 characteristics that you are writing down. Again, these will be things that you need to be able to identify and differentiate, so make sure you take good notes. First trait, rejection of the idealized, larger-than-life hero of romantic literature. Because we're focusing on the working class and because we're focusing on city and industry, we are dealing with heroes who are these little-known men and women who are trying to make something of themselves. Detailed depiction of ordinary characters and realistic events should be easy to remember because the period is called realism. But again, we're not focusing on these overdramatic, foofy characters. We are focusing on realistic people. Emphasis on characters from cities and lower classes. The Gilded Age was all about riches and wealth, but there was 1% of people who had that wealth. Sounds familiar to what's happening today. Anyway, so they wanted that, but there were millions of people who were striving for that kind of wealth, and they couldn't get it, right? It just wasn't happening because there were monopolies on all of these different industries. And so writers and artists who were part of those classes a lot of the times, or at least were inspired by those classes, focused on them, which then made their literature really relatable for the masses. Avoidance of the exotic, sensational, overdramatic. Again, this is realistic. We want to focus on real people. And then use of everyday speech patterns to reveal class distinctions. So once again, realistic characters mean that we have people with Southern accents. We're differentiating people based on the way that they talk. And so when we get to Mark Twain, that's going to be something that you notice right away is it's actually, I'm going to read it out loud to you because it's pretty difficult to read on your own. It's a slow process because he breaks down the language so that as you're reading it in the accent. And then finally, focus on the ethical struggles and social issues of real life situations. So we're dealing with things, real people, real problems, and really trying to focus on what makes a person good and how do we solve real life problems. So those are the realism notes. We are going to be identifying realism traits in the text that we look at, and then we'll also be looking at naturalism traits. The naturalism traits are An attempt to analyze human behavior objectively as a scientist would. So we're not trying to like relate to these characters and build a connection with them like you would be in a realist text. Naturalism is we've got this bird's eye view of a human being and the actions they're taking, and we are analyzing their behavior. All right, it's very scientific. Belief that human behavior is determined by heredity and environment. So the fact that I am the way that I am because of where I grew up, who my parents were, and what I've been exposed to. There's kind of a lack of control then, which brings us back to this comparison almost to the Puritans, and this idea that who we are and what is going to happen to us is predetermined, which then directly transitions into a sense that human beings cannot control their own destinies. Very Puritan, not based on religion this time, based on science. And finally, the most dramatic and depressing, the sense that life is a losing battle against an uncaring universe. Nice, right? Always a happy story in English 11. So, to compare and contrast these different literary genres, it'll be helpful for you to think of one as half full and one as half empty. Optimistic, pessimistic. I bet right away you can think to yourself right now, which of these literary writers, naturalist or realist, would view the glass half full and which would view it half empty? So to help you remember, think about it as smiling realism and grim naturalism. Smiling realism is this optimistic view of ordinary people. They may act foolishly, but good qualities will always eventually win out because we're focusing on ethical struggles and we want our characters to succeed. Grim naturalism is objective and scientific analysis of humans due to emerging fields of psychology and sociology. So now, because there's these writers, these naturalists were so inspired by the scientific discoveries, they're applying that to human beings, which takes a sense of control from what human beings are doing. So as we move into literature, I want you to be thinking about when you're reading a text, is this a realist text? Why? Is this a naturalist text? Why? As long as you can defend your answer with textual evidence and reasoning, you're going to be just fine. Okay? All right. That was a lot of notes. The video might be shorter than the actual note-taking process. So what I want you to do now is I want you to go back to your notes and catch up, look through the slides, and write down anything that you've missed. The most important thing that you understand is the different traits between the two genres. Okay? Tomorrow we will look at irony, which will be a good time using Disney movies. So look forward to that. Until tomorrow.